I never saw the other car coming. One moment I was driving home from my sister's house, singing along to a song on the radio, thinking about what to make for dinner. The next, there was a flash of headlights cutting across my lane, a deafening impact, and then nothing. Just darkness, deep, total, and silent. I woke up inside that darkness, not slowly, the way you surface from a heavy sleep. All at once, like a switch had been flipped somewhere inside my skull. My mind was sharp, alert, almost painfully aware, but my body was completely gone. I couldn't feel my fingers, couldn't turn my head, couldn't force a single sound past my lips. I could hear, though. That was the cruelest part. The hospital sounds came first, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum floors, the distant murmur of voices behind closed doors. Then came the smell, antiseptic, stiff sheets, recycled air. I knew exactly where I was before anyone said a word. The neurologist explained my condition to my husband, Daniel, in a voice carefully stripped of emotion. Locked-in syndrome, he called it. Extremely rare. Full cognitive function, near total motor paralysis. They weren't sure how long it would last. They weren't sure it would reverse at all. Daniel asked 3 questions. He asked whether I could feel pain. The doctor said probably not, given the nature of the paralysis. He asked about long-term care costs. The doctor gave a number that made the room go quiet. Then Daniel asked about life insurance, specifically whether a condition like mine would affect a pending claim. I remember the exact moment I understood what I was hearing. Not because of the question itself, but because of his tone. There was no tremor in it. No raw edge of a man who had just been told his wife might never speak again. It was the flat, focused voice of someone running calculations, someone already thinking several steps ahead. The doctor answered carefully and left the room. Daniel sat beside my bed for a while after that. He held my hand. I couldn't feel it, but I heard the chair shift, heard him exhale slowly. Then he said something I will never forget, spoken so quietly it was almost to himself. "This is actually going to work out." He left 20 minutes later. He told the nurses he needed to get some rest. He said it had been an overwhelming day. He didn't come back that night. I lay in the dark for hours, listening to the monitors trace the steady rhythm of a life he was already planning around. My mind was turning, sharp and furious, cataloging every detail, the questions he had asked, the tone of his voice, the words he thought no one conscious had heard. I had a choice to make, right there in that hospital bed. I could signal somehow, blink in a pattern, do whatever it took to alert the medical staff that I was aware, that I was present, that I had heard everything, or I could wait. I chose to wait. Daniel visited the hospital every day for the first week. I know because I counted. 7 visits in 7 days, each one carefully timed for maximum visibility. He always arrived when the nursing staff was busiest, when other patients had visitors in the hallway, when there were witnesses. He would sit beside my bed, speak in a low, pained voice, and occasionally press his forehead against my hand, in a gesture that looked, I imagined, devastatingly sincere. But I noticed things the witnesses didn't. He never talked to me directly, not once. He talked around me, to the nurses, to the doctors, to my sister Rachel when she came on the 3rd day, and wept openly at the foot of my bed. He performed grief the way a rehearsed actor performs a monologue, every pause in the right place, every sigh carefully measured. Rachel held my hand and talked to me like I was still there. She told me about her garden, about her youngest daughter's school play, about the lasagna she was going to make me the moment I came home. Her voice cracked on the word home, and I would have given anything in that moment to squeeze her fingers, to tell her I was listening, to tell her what I already knew. I said nothing. I stayed still. By the 2nd week, the visits shortened. Daniel began arriving later in the day, staying for 20 minutes instead of an hour. The performative grief started showing its seams. The sighs became impatient, the silences between his words less mournful and more distracted. Once he took a phone call in my room, standing at the window with his back to me, speaking in a low voice that he clearly believed carried no risk. I caught fragments. A name, Claire, repeated twice. A reference to the house. Something about timing. By the 3rd week, he stopped coming to the hospital entirely. The nurses noticed. 2 of them spoke about it quietly near my door one evening, their voices careful, but not careful enough. One said it was understandable, that some people simply couldn't handle long-term medical situations. The other said nothing, but I heard her set something down with more force than necessary. Rachel came every other day without fail. One afternoon, she sat beside me for 2 hours without speaking much at all, just holding my hand and watching the window. At some point, she said very quietly, "Something feels wrong, Nora. Something feels very wrong." She was right, because that same evening, I heard Daniel's voice for the first time in 11 days, not in the hospital, but through the smart home speaker on my bedside table. He had forgotten it was connected to the system at home. He had forgotten, or he simply no longer cared, that sound carried both ways. I heard a woman's laughter in the background. I heard my husband laugh back, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that the hospital was no longer where the real story was happening. That night, I made the most important decision of my life, not out of panic, not out of heartbreak, though the heartbreak was there, sitting heavy and cold beneath everything else. I made it with the kind of clarity that only comes when all the noise is stripped away, and you are left with nothing but your own mind, and the truth it has assembled piece by piece. I was going to go home, not because I was ready, not because my body had given me any indication that it intended to cooperate, but because I had realized something critical lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and recycled air, and the distant sounds of a building full of people who had no idea what I knew. Everything Daniel was doing, he was doing where I couldn't see it. If I stayed in the hospital, I would continue hearing fragments, pieces, half conversations filtered through a smart speaker he had already forgotten about. I would know enough to be destroyed by it, but not enough to do anything meaningful in return. But if I went home, if I was transferred to home care, the way Daniel had already begun quietly suggesting to the medical team, I would be inside the house, inside the rooms where the real conversations happened, where the plans were being made, where the evidence was being created, carelessly and continuously, by two people who believed they were completely alone. I needed to get myself home without revealing that I was conscious. The neurologist visited my room the following morning. He spoke to me the way all of them did, gently, professionally, with the particular brand of kindness reserved for patients assumed to be unreachable. He checked my responses, noted something on his tablet, and was almost at the door when I did it. One blink, deliberate, controlled. He stopped, turned back, leaned close, and asked me to blink again if I could hear him. I blinked once more. What followed was 2 hours of careful, quiet assessment. The neurologist was precise and calm. He explained that what I was experiencing aligned with a rare but documented form of locked-in syndrome, where awareness preceded motor recovery by weeks or even months. He told me, with great gentleness, that I had options. I communicated slowly, using a blink-based system he established on the spot. It was exhausting and imprecise, but it was enough. I told him I wanted to go home. I told him I did not want my husband informed of my level of awareness. He paused at that, long enough that I thought he might refuse. Then he asked, with careful neutrality, whether I had a reason for that request. I blinked once for yes. He studied my face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there was enough. He documented my awareness as minimal and emerging. He recommended home care transition within the week. And he gave me something no one else in that building could have given me at that moment. He gave me time. They brought me home on a Tuesday morning. I remember the specific quality of the light, pale and thin, the way late autumn light is in Connecticut, filtering through bare branches and landing without warmth on everything it touched. The transport team was professional and efficient. They transferred me to the hospital bed that had been set up in what used to be our living room, adjusted my monitors, reviewed my care schedule with the home nurse, and left within the hour. Daniel stood in the doorway the entire time, watching. He was dressed well. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the rumpled, exhausted clothing of a man keeping vigil over a suffering wife, but pressed trousers and a collared shirt, his hair neat, his expression arranged into something that passed for somber if you didn't look too carefully. He thanked the transport team. He shook hands with the home nurse, a quiet woman named Patricia, and told her he was grateful for everything she would be doing. Patricia seemed like a decent person. She set up her station methodically, checked my vitals with practiced efficiency, and spoke to me directly. Not over me, not around me, but to me, when she adjusted my position. Daniel waited until she stepped out of the room. Then he walked to the foot of my bed and stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 14 years of marriage. It wasn't grief, it wasn't guilt. It was something closer to assessment, the look of a man taking inventory. He said, "Well, here we are. Nothing else." He left the room and I heard him on the phone within minutes, his voice low but no longer cautious. He had already decided that the house was safe, that I was furniture, that the walls had no ears worth worrying about. He was wrong on every count. Before the accident, I had spent 3 months upgrading our smart home system. It had started as a practical project. Better security cameras, voice-activated controls for when my hands were full, remote access for when we traveled. Daniel had shown no interest in the process whatsoever. Technology bored him. He had never once opened the app. Every camera was still active. Every audio device was still connected. Everything fed continuously to an encrypted cloud account that Daniel didn't know existed, monitored remotely by the one person I trusted without reservation, my college roommate, Sylvia, who lived in Portland and had been carefully briefed through a series of blinked communications relayed by the neurologist over 3 days. Sylvia had been recording since the moment I left the hospital. By the time Daniel ended his phone call that Tuesday afternoon and walked back through the living room without looking at me, we had already captured 40 minutes of usable audio. I lay still beneath the pale autumn light and listened to my house breathe around me. The real work was just beginning. She arrived on a Friday evening. I had been home for 3 days by then, long enough to map the sounds of the house from my new position, the creak of the third stair, the particular way the front door settled back into its frame, the hollow echo of footsteps on the hardwood floor in the hallway. I had cataloged everything. I knew Daniel's patterns already. When he woke, when he left, how long he stayed away, what time he came back smelling of something that wasn't his cologne. Friday evening he came home earlier than usual. I heard him move through the house with a kind of restless energy, opening and closing things, running water, changing the music on the living room speaker to something low and deliberately atmospheric. Patricia had finished her evening rounds and left at 6. Daniel had smiled warmly at the door and wished her a good weekend. The front door opened again at 7:43. I heard heels on the entryway tile. Then laughter, bright and unguarded. The laughter of someone who had been here before and felt entirely comfortable returning. Daniel's voice dropped into a register I recognized, but hadn't heard directed at anyone in a very long time. Warm, playful, unbothered. They walked past the living room doorway without slowing down. She glanced in as they passed. I couldn't see her. My field of vision from the hospital bed was fixed and limited, but I heard her pause for just a fraction of a second, her heels going quiet, and then Daniel said something low and she laughed again, and they continued down the hallway toward the bedroom, toward our bedroom. I focused on my breathing, slow and even, the way it had to look on the monitors, in through whatever involuntary process was keeping me alive, out again, steady, controlled. I had become very good at separating what my mind was doing from what my body was allowed to show. My mind was doing quite a lot. Her name was Claire. I had already known that from the hospital fragments. What I hadn't known was the ease of her, the complete absence of hesitation in her movements, the way she spoke about the house in possessive terms that told me she had been building a life here in her imagination for long enough that it felt real. She commented on a painting in the hallway. She asked Daniel when he was planning to redecorate. He said soon. They stayed in the bedroom for a long time. When they finally moved to the kitchen, their voices carried more clearly. Claire opened the refrigerator like she knew exactly what was inside. She did, because she asked Daniel why he had moved the wine to the lower shelf. He had moved it 3 days ago. She had been here 3 days ago, the night he told the nurses he needed rest. I heard Sylvia's notification ping, barely audible, from the small device tucked beneath my pillow. She was watching. She was recording. I stayed perfectly still and let them talk. It happened on a Sunday night, 11 days after I came home. Daniel and Claire had settled into a rhythm by then, a domestic routine built on the assumption that the woman in the living room was nothing more than a medical inconvenience, a breathing obstacle between them and everything they wanted. Claire came 4 nights a week. She brought groceries. She cooked in my kitchen using my pans, wearing an apron that had been a gift from my mother. I heard every meal, every conversation, every plan. But Sunday night was different. Patricia had called in sick. The replacement nurse was young, overwhelmed, and spent most of her shift in the kitchen on her phone. Daniel noticed immediately and relaxed in a way I hadn't heard before, his voice losing its last remaining layer of caution, opening up in the way people do when they believe themselves to be genuinely unobserved. They sat at the dining room table after dinner. I could hear the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped pretending for the evening. Then Daniel started talking. He began with the life insurance policy, a joint policy we had taken out 6 years ago. significant enough that he spoke the number with a particular kind of reverence. He explained to Claire that the payout structure had a clause he had recently had reviewed by someone he trusted. As long as the death was not ruled suspicious, the full amount released within 90 days. Claire asked what the doctors were saying about my prognosis. Daniel said the neurologist had described my condition as unlikely to improve meaningfully. He said this with confidence, which told me he had either misunderstood what he'd been told, or had chosen a version of events that served him better. Then he said something that made the monitors beside me feel very loud in the silence of my own skull. He said he had already spoken to someone about the equipment. He didn't use clinical language. He used the language of logistics, of timelines and arrangements and making things look natural. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she asked how long. Daniel said 6 weeks, maybe less, depending on how things moved. Claire set her glass down. I heard it, a clean, certain sound. She said, "And the house goes to you outright?" He said yes. The house, the accounts, the investment portfolio, everything we had built together, everything I had contributed to with 14 years of work and trust, was already mentally transferred in his mind to a future I had no place in. Claire said, "Then we're almost there, almost there." I held those 2 words inside my chest like stones. Beneath my pillow, the small device registered Sylvia's response. 2 short vibrations, our agreed signal. She had captured everything. Every word was now stored in 3 separate locations, encrypted and time-stamped, waiting with the same patience I had learned to wear like a second skin. 6 weeks, Daniel had said. I gave myself 3. The 2nd week of November, Claire made a mistake. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was the kind of mistake that careless people make when they have been careless for long enough that caution starts to feel unnecessary. A small, thoughtless act that she almost certainly forgot about within minutes of committing it. She went through my closet. I heard it on a Wednesday afternoon when Daniel was out, and Claire had let herself in with a key she clearly hadn't been given recently. She moved through the house with the unhurried confidence of someone taking a long, satisfying look at an inheritance. She spent time in the kitchen, opened drawers, ran her hand along the bookshelves in the hallway. I tracked her by sound, building a map of her movements the way I had learned to build everything in those weeks, through patience, through attention, through the discipline of absolute stillness. Then she came to the bedroom. She was in there for 40 minutes. The cameras Daniel had never learned to look for captured everything in high definition. Sylvia confirmed it that evening through our signal system. 4 vibrations, our code for significant new material. Sylvia described what the cameras had captured, and the details alone were enough to understand why. Later, when I finally saw the footage myself, I understood why. Claire had tried on 7 of my dresses. She had stood in front of the mirror I had hung on the back of the closet door 3 years ago, turning slowly, examining herself with an expression of calm ownership that made the footage almost unwatchable. She had opened my jewelry box, the antique one my grandmother had left me, the one I kept locked, with a key she had apparently found in Daniel's bedside drawer. She took 3 pieces, a pearl bracelet, a gold necklace with a small diamond pendant, my grandmother's emerald ring. She put them in her bag and left the house 40 minutes before Daniel returned. She didn't know that the jewelry box had a secondary camera embedded in the hinge, a precaution I had installed 8 months ago after we'd had a break-in on our street. She didn't know that every item she touched had been cataloged in a personal inventory document stored in Sylvia's possession. She didn't know that taking those 3 pieces had just added theft to a list of charges that was growing longer by the day. Daniel noticed nothing missing that evening, or if he did, he said nothing. But I had what I needed. Sylvia was already in contact with the attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, recommended by Rachel's husband, who practiced family and criminal law in Hartford. Sylvia had been feeding her information carefully and incrementally for 2 weeks, building a case file that Margaret had described, in a message relayed back through our system, as exceptionally well documented. Margaret's word, according to Sylvia, was airtight. I held that word in the dark and let it settle over everything Daniel and Claire had built on the assumption that I was already gone. Airtight. They had no idea what was waiting for them on the other side of my silence. There is a particular kind of endurance that has nothing to do with physical strength. I had learned that in the weeks since coming home, lying motionless while the world moved around me, processing things that would have broken a different version of myself, storing rage in places deep enough that it didn't show on my face or alter the rhythm of my breathing. I had become something I didn't have a word for, not a victim, not yet a survivor, something in between, something forged in silence and sustained by purpose. But the third week of November tested every bit of it. Daniel brought Claire to the living room. Not the bedroom, not the kitchen, the living room, where my hospital bed sat against the wall beneath the window, where my monitors beeped their steady, indifferent rhythm, where I lay every hour of every day with nowhere to retreat to, and no way to close a door between myself and whatever was happening around me. They sat on the couch 6 feet from where I lay, and had a conversation about my funeral. Not in those words. Daniel was careful with language when he was close to me. Some residual instinct, perhaps, or simple legal caution. But the meaning was unmistakable. He talked about the service being small, about which of my friends he planned to notify and which he didn't feel were necessary, about the cemetery plot, and whether it made more sense to choose cremation given the cost differential. Claire offered opinions, thoughtful ones, delivered in a soft voice, as though her consideration for the logistics of my death was a form of kindness. At one point, she looked directly at me. I know because Daniel said, "Don't let it bother you," in response to something I didn't hear her say aloud, and she laughed, quietly, and looked away. I focused on a fixed point somewhere beyond the ceiling and breathed. In, out, steady. Beneath my pillow, the device registered Sylvia's signal. One long vibration, slow and deliberate. Our code for, "I'm here. I see this. Hold on." I held on. That night, after they had moved to the kitchen and then eventually to the bedroom and the house had gone quiet, I made a decision that I had been approaching for days but hadn't been ready to commit to until that moment on the couch, with Claire's attention settling over me like I was already a memory. I was done waiting for the perfect moment. There is no perfect moment. There is only the moment you decide that enough has been taken from you. Enough silence, enough stillness, enough of lying in your own house like a ghost, while two people dismantle your life around you and call it planning. I blinked 3 times into the darkness of the room, our signal to Sylvia for, move to the next phase. Within an hour, she had contacted Margaret Chen. Within 2 days, Margaret had contacted the people we needed. It was time to wake up. Margaret Chen moved quickly once I gave the signal. Within 48 hours, she had assembled exactly the right people, a process she described to Sylvia as surgical, her word for the kind of precision that leaves no room for error and no avenue for retreat. Every person selected had a specific role. Every role had been thought through from multiple angles. There would be no improvisation on the day itself. There would be no margin for Daniel to regroup, reframe, or deflect. The plan was simple in structure and devastating in detail. Margaret would arrive at the house on a Thursday morning under the pretense of a routine legal visit, estate documentation, the kind of administrative visit that Daniel himself had requested weeks earlier when he began quietly restructuring our joint accounts. He had actually invited her into the house without knowing who she was working for. That detail, when Sylvia relayed it, was the closest thing to satisfaction I had felt in weeks. She would bring 2 witnesses, a notary and a private investigator who had spent the previous 10 days independently corroborating everything Sylvia had documented. His report, Margaret said, was thorough enough to stand alone even without the recordings. Rachel would be there. That was the part that required the most careful coordination. Rachel knew something was wrong. She had said so herself months ago at my bedside, and her instincts had only sharpened in the weeks since. Sylvia had reached her through a method that left no digital trace connected to me, and Rachel had listened to everything without speaking for a very long time. When she finally responded, she said 4 words, "Tell me what to do." She would arrive at the house at the same time as Margaret, ostensibly for a regular visit. Daniel tolerated Rachel's visits because they cost him nothing, and maintained the appearance of a grieving husband surrounded by a supportive family. He had no reason to expect that this visit would be different from any other. The neurologist had also been briefed. He had documented my awareness with meticulous care since that first afternoon in the hospital when I blinked twice and changed everything. His record showed a clear and consistent progression, a patient with full cognitive function, who had made an informed and legally documented choice to withhold disclosure of her awareness for reasons of personal safety. Margaret had reviewed his notes and used a word I had come to rely on: airtight. The recordings, the stolen jewelry, the financial documentation, Daniel's confession about the equipment, all of it packaged, time-stamped, and ready. Patricia, my home nurse, had been quietly informed the evening before. She arrived Thursday morning at her usual time, performed her usual routine, and positioned herself in the hallway outside the living room, without drawing any attention to the fact that she had not left the house at her scheduled departure time. Everyone was in place. Daniel sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, completely unaware that the house he believed he had already won was about to become the place where he lost everything. I lay still for the last time and waited for the door to open. The front door opened at 9:47 in the morning. I heard Margaret's heels on the entryway tile, measured, unhurried, the steps of someone who had done difficult things in difficult rooms and knew exactly how to move through them. Rachel came in behind her. I recognized my sister's particular rhythm immediately, the slightly uneven cadence of someone holding themselves together by force of will. Daniel greeted them in the hallway. His voice carried the warm, practiced tone he reserved for occasions that required an audience, solicitous and faintly sorrowful, the performance of a devoted husband navigating an unimaginable situation. He offered coffee. He thanked Rachel for coming. He asked Margaret something about paperwork. Margaret said they should all go to the living room. There was a brief pause. Daniel preferred to keep legal conversations in the kitchen, away from the monitors, away from the room where the reality of what he was doing was most visible. But Margaret was already moving, and Rachel was already following, and Daniel had no graceful way to redirect without drawing attention to why he wanted to. They came into the living room. I heard them arrange themselves, chairs pulled from the corner, the soft sound of a bag being set on the floor, Rachel sitting close to my bed the way she always did. Daniel positioned himself near the doorway. Old instinct, I imagined, always knowing where the exit was. Margaret spoke first. She identified herself fully, her name, her firm, her role as legal counsel. She mentioned the private investigator's name and noted that his report had been filed the previous afternoon. She referenced the recordings by their file designations, clinical and precise. Daniel's voice changed, not dramatically, just a degree or two of warmth draining out of it, replaced by something careful and watchful. He started to say something about not understanding what this was about. Margaret told him clearly what it was about. The room went very quiet. In that quiet, I opened my eyes. It wasn't dramatic the way I had once imagined it might be. No gasping, no sudden flood of movement. Just my eyes, opening slowly and with complete control, adjusting to the pale November light coming through the window. I had stared at the ceiling above for weeks. Rachel made a sound I will never forget for as long as I live. Daniel said my name, once, in a voice I had never heard from him, stripped of every layer of performance, down to something raw and unrecognizable. I turned my head toward him slowly. Then I looked at Margaret, and I blinked once, our established signal, and she nodded and pressed play on the device in her hand. Daniel's voice filled the room. His real voice, the one he used when he believed no one who mattered was listening, talking about timelines and equipment and 90-day insurance clauses. I watched his face while he listened to himself, and for the first time in months, I spoke. My voice was rough and unsteady from weeks of silence, but the words were clear. I heard everything, Daniel. Every single word. The ghost in the room had been the architect all along, and the house was mine again. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. It means more than you know. Now I want to hear from you. Do you have a story you think we should tell next? Drop it in the comments. Real stories, incredible twists, moments that changed everything. We read every single one. And here's my question for you today. What would you have done in Nora's place? Would you have revealed yourself sooner? Would you have confronted Daniel at the hospital? Or would you have played it exactly the way she did? Silent, patient, and absolutely deadly. Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. If this story moved you, surprised you, or kept you holding your breath, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. Every week we bring you stories that remind you just how strong people can be when everything is on the line. And speaking of strength, next time, we're bringing you a story about a woman who discovered her entire identity had been stolen. Not by a stranger, but by someone sitting across from her at the dinner table every single night. You will not see the ending coming. We'll see you there.